Hello and welcome, friend, to History Raids with Fjorn. And no, it's not as violent as it sounds. I'm Fjorn the Skald, your host with a master's degree in history, here to pillage the past on your behalf, metaphorically. The plunder you're about to hear today was originally produced in 2018, when I was still working on my master's. As a result, some information may be outdated by the time you're listening to this. My past self could even be wrong. If so, you can send corrections via the contact form linked in this episode's description. There, you will also find links to the sources I used in this episode, for your extra plundering pleasure. You can also find even more resources at fjorntheskald.com, including interactive digital maps. I should also note that this podcast supports inclusivity, regardless of race, and stands as an ally with the LGBTQ+ community. If you want to support this show and its Skald, simply share it around like Odin's ravens. You can also send a humble tip to my Ko-fi.com page. If you are a fan of fantasy, though, you could just go read or listen to my web novels that I serialize for free under the name Fjolnir. That would, in fact, bring me the most joy. But anyway, that's enough blathering from me. Let's get on to the whole raiding history thing. Today, in this podcast debut, we're going to set the bar high by talking about something awesome, legendary swords. But instead of pulling them from stones, we're going to find them plunged into trees by a strange old man and stolen from burial mounds by marauding Icelanders. But while we may not become the king of Britain in the process, we are going to slay a dragon, cut off someone's back end, and get caught up in a few duels. Honestly, the sagas are full of special swords with fancy names and magical properties, but we can't cover them all in a single gathering. So for now, we'll just have to settle for 3. Gramr from Volsunga Saga, Sköfnungr from Saga Kraka, which actually gets passed around by Icelanders in other sagas, so we'll be covering a few of those as well. And Grásíða from Gísla Saga. And unless you have unreasonably high standards, these swords shouldn't disappoint. We'll start things off by discussing one sword at a time, where I'll summarize their role in a saga, or multiple sagas, while offering my thoughts and commentary along the way. I'll save most of the academic input for the end of the gathering, when we'll bring everything together and talk about the common themes that our examples share, which should bring us to some kind of appreciation for the deeper meanings that these swords could have within Norse society and culture. If not, we'll at least have some cool stories to tell our friends, who desperately need more sagas in their lives. So let's get this thing started. Our first sword is called Gramr, which could mean angry, but only if we assume that its name comes from the identical Old Norse adjective with that meaning. Unfortunately, it's pretty typical for these names to come without detailed explanations, despite how important a sword's name probably was. We can only really speculate based on linguistics or overall context, such as how the sword is used in a given saga, but for now we'll just leave it there. The saga that this sword comes from is called Volsunga Saga, or the Saga of the Volsungs. It belongs to a literary genre known as the Fornaldarsögur, or sagas of ancient times. But they are typically referred to as legendary sagas in English, since their events are set in a distant heroic age filled with great heroes, legendary kings, and mythological figures. For this saga, its events stem from the historical memory of things that occurred between the 4th and 5th centuries, which have been passed down through generations of oral storytelling. But the saga itself was written much later, sometime during the 13th century by an anonymous Icelander. So regardless of how much old lore this saga contains, it has come to us through the relentless filter of time, and has been reworked by an author writing for his own contemporary Icelandic audience. As a result, these sagas, along with sagas from a few other genres, are generally considered to be combinations of collective historical memory and the artistic literary techniques of a later storyteller. But I would also add that the storyteller's audience, the society in which they live, also plays a role in determining how the threads of history end up weaved into the retold narrative of the saga. But to end this academic warning label, the golden rule for reading a saga, as you'll tire of hearing me say, is to read it from the perspective of the culture and society that actually wrote it, rather than attributing a complete historical reality to the contents of the saga itself. While that may sound dull and disappointing, It's far more rewarding that way. Well, at least if you're someone who studies these things for a living. But regardless of its historical credibility, this saga has some really great stuff to offer. And although we'll only be talking about the parts relevant to our chosen sword, Gramr, we're going to encounter some mysterious figures, epic battles against kings, and even a fight with a dragon. And if in the meantime this saga captivates your heart, consider picking up a copy and reading it for yourself. I've included a link to the translation that I've used for this gathering in the description. But let's get on with the saga already. Our story begins with a man named Siggi, who was the son of Odin. He's really not important when it comes to our sword, but he is the first member of the family that this saga is named after, the Volsungs. So regardless of how unimportant he really is for our story today, he is the direct descendant of Odin himself, and that's nothing to shy away from. Odin takes on a big role in this saga because he frequently appears to help members of this family achieve victory or continue the family line. But our sword comes into play just after a few generations, with Siggi's grandson, Volsung. He married a wish maiden named Fjorn, who was probably one of Odin's Valkyries, but also the daughter of a giant named Hrimnir. Together they had several children, but only two are important enough to actually have names, a son named Sigmund and a daughter named Signy, who were twins. This happy family lived in an excellent hall with a massive tree called Barnstokkr growing in the middle of it. This tree probably shares some connection with the world tree Yggdrasil from Norse mythology. But one day, another powerful king named Siggeir came to their hall, intending to ask for Signy's hand in marriage. Volsung and his sons thought well of the idea, but Signy was against it. Despite her disapproval, though, she left the decision to her father, and so she ended up betrothed to Siggeir anyway. Now, from my saga reading experience, which I'll admit is shamefully thin, it's never a sign of good times to come when a woman is forced into a marriage that she is against. For anyone familiar with Njal's saga, for example, you may recall Halgard's first marriage with Thorvald. She wasn't consulted at all, and so with the help of her murder-loving, bloody, axe-wielding uncle, she got rid of that shabby man and was able to marry someone she approved of. And although we haven't quite gotten there yet, Signy will be about as loving to Siggeir as Halgard was to Thorvald. But of course, everybody else decides to throw a lavish feast to celebrate this wonderful occasion. The best food is served, the long hearth is roaring warmly, and everyone is chatting happily. But our saga has only just begun. While their night may seem like it's going rather well, their mirth ends when a strange man with a sword enters the hall. I don't think I can do this scene justice through a summary alone, so I'll read it from the saga itself. As he walked up to Barnstokkr, he held a sword in his hand while over his head was a low-hanging hood. He was very tall and grey with age, and he had only one eye. He brandished the sword and thrust it into the trunk so that it sank up to the hilt. Words of welcome failed everyone. Then the man began to speak. "He who draws this sword out of the trunk shall receive it from me as a gift, and he himself shall prove that he had never carried a better sword than this one." If you know your Norse mythology, I'm sure you already know who this mysterious man is, and if not, I'm going to spoil it for you. That old man was Odin himself, and the sword that he carried, although it hasn't been given its name yet, that's Gramr. But why does he bring this sword into the hall? A gift from Odin comes with additional baggage. As the unpredictable god of war, a gift from Odin also implies a blessing of victory. In other words, anyone wielding this sword will not only have a marvelous weapon, but will also be granted victory whenever wielding it in battle. Whether they knew this or not, the apparently great and noble men there in the hall that evening immediately scrambled to pull the sword from the tree, but they all failed. But when Sigmund went to pull the sword, it came out without any struggle, as if the sword was meant for him. But one man in particular wasn't very happy for Sigmund. Siggeir came up to him and offered money for the sword, 3 times its weight in gold as a matter of fact. But Sigmund replied, "You could have taken this sword from where it stood no less than I did if it were meant for you to carry it. But now that it has come first into my hands, you will never obtain it, even should you offer me all the gold you own." Of course, this enraged Siggeir, and he tried to hide it so he didn't seem like a bad guest. But despite them being brothers by marriage, tension was already brewing between these families. Sigurd was already plotting his revenge, intending to summon Volsung and his sons to a feast of his own so that he can kill them all. Signy desperately tries to warn her family about his dark intentions, but they stubbornly refuse to listen to her, saying that they must uphold the bonds of this marriage by coming to the feast. And so Sigurd's plan unfolds. Volsung falls in battle, and his sons are all captured. To make a long but wonderful story short, Sigmund is the only son who survives this, thanks to Signy's help. All he had to do was cover his face and mouth with honey and bite off the tongue of a she-wolf. And after that, they worked together to get their vengeance for their father's death, which includes murdering her own children and having an incestuous relationship to produce the most ideal warrior possible, all over the course of several decades. But that's a part of the saga for another day, perhaps. To return to our sword, Sigmund and his new son Sinfjotli end up trapped in a large cairn with no way to escape, but Signy comes once again to save the day, dropping Sigmund's sword into the cairn after disguising it as food. And using this sword, Sigmund is able to cut the stone like butter, thus allowing them to escape. And so Odin's words are starting to prove true. This is indeed a fine sword. And so we can add a new quality to this blade. Not only does it grant victory, but it also has incredible sharpness and durability. After all, not any sword can cut a stone of that size. After this escape, things start to go well again. Sigmund and Signy extract their revenge by burning Sigurd's hall to the ground with him in it, and Sigmund goes on to marry a woman named Hjordis. But this peace does not last long. You see, someone else wants to marry Hjordis, so they wage war against Sigmund in retaliation. And although he is now an old man, Sigmund charges into battle with his sword of victory held high. But suddenly, in the midst of battle, a strange man enters the fight. As the saga relates, he had a wide-brimmed hat that sloped over his face, and he wore a black hooded cloak. He had one eye, and he held a spear in his hand. This man came up against King Sigmund, raising the spear before him. When Sigmund struck hard with his sword, it broke in two against the spear. Then the tide of battle turned, for King Sigmund's luck was now gone. What the heck just happened? This sword was meant to ensure his victory, so why did he lose? The answer is Odin, who is an erratic figure from Norse lore. While he does grant people victory, he also takes it away from them without any warning. But in reality, Odin did Sigmund a favor, at least in Odin's eye. Sigmund was an old man, and it was far more honorable for him to die in battle rather than die a peaceful death in his old age. And so Odin appeared again to break his agreement with Sigmund, which he does by breaking the sword that promised him victory. But our sword story does not end here, although it has been shattered. After the battle, Hjordis goes to Sigmund, and as he draws his final breath, he tells her that she is with a child, a son, and that she must guard the broken pieces of his sword, for it shall one day be reforged into a new sword called Gramr. So while Sigmund was denied victory, his family was not. Rather, the sword's blessing was simply passed on to the next generation, to his son named Sigurd, who is the true hero of this saga. The saga fits Sigurd within the mold of a traditional hero from the very beginning. He has piercing eyes, and no one else could match his conduct or size. He was raised in the court of a king and fostered by a man named Regin, who taught him sports, chess, and the secrets of runes. But Regin has his own motives, and as time goes on, Regin goads the young Sigurd into seeking more wealth and greater honor. Eventually, Regin tells him of a dragon named Fafnir, who guards a great hoard of treasure. Sigurd knows of this dragon, since no man dares to challenge him because of his size and ferocity, but Regin responds, "That is not true. His size is no different from that of other grass snakes, and more is made of it than it deserves." Then he taunts Sigurd even more, saying that he is clearly lacking the spirit of his courageous ancestors. So Sigurd responds, "There is no need to taunt me when I am yet little past childhood, but why do you urge me so strongly?" Regin goes on to tell the story of Fafnir's origin, along with how the great treasure came to be. But it is more important for our discussion today to talk about our young hero, who will soon wield the sword of our story. Although Regin is taunting a young beardless lad, this is a typical trope of heroic tales from traditional folklore. The hero of legend is always exceptional, even when very young. In fact, it is probably their boyhood deeds that truly distinguish them as a hero within society. A great example of this elsewhere is Cuchulainn from Irish literature. Like Sigurd, he is gifted with many talents and goes to battle as a young beardless boy. But despite his youth, he is the most formidable warrior that Ireland has ever seen. The same can be said of Sigurd, who is about to prove that he is worthy of a heroic saga himself, despite his lack of facial hair. After telling Sigurd the story about Fafnir, Sigurd agrees to slay him. But he has two conditions: that Regin forge him a sword worthy of the deed, and that he may use this sword to take vengeance for his father before slaying Fafnir. And so Regin agrees and gets to work. The first sword that Regin makes is useless. Sigurd just picks it up and says, "This is your smithying, Regin," before breaking it over the anvil. Sigurd just throws this blade down and demands another. Of course, Regin forges another blade, this time feeling more confident in himself. But Sigurd picks it up once again and breaks it over the anvil, saying to Regin, "You are untrustworthy, just like your forefathers." Sigurd's a bit of a jerk, isn't he? But that's just how these heroic types are. And so, feeling impatient and a bit salty, Sigurd leaves and demands the broken pieces of his father's sword from his mother, and after receiving them, he goes back to Regin and demands yet another sword, but this time, a sword worthy of these fragments. Regin agrees, mumbling under his breath with anger and frustration. Once he finishes, though, Sigurd takes the blade and smashes it on the anvil. But this time, the sword doesn't break. The anvil, however, is cut in half. And if this was not impressive enough, the sword was so sharp that it cut wool as it flowed through a river. This may not sound impressive if you're not familiar with wool, but it's not actually that easy to cut normally. But this sword is so sharp that it can cut wool with no effort at all. And so our legendary sword has been reforged, and even its return has been coated with typical heroic tropes. It took 3 times to forge this legendary sword anew, and that's a special number when it comes to legends from folklore. Things often happen in threes, or take 3 tries before being successful, and so our sword itself has experienced a heroic rebirth. With Gramr now in his hands, Sigurd set out to complete his first task, to avenge the death of his father. And so he departed with a large force and met his enemy in battle. After this battle had gone on for a long time, Sigurd charged through their ranks with his great sword, and no piece of armor could withstand its sharp edge. And so he fought on the front lines of his troops until he had killed the man who dealt his father death. And he even killed all of the man's sons, so that they could not take vengeance against Sigurd for this deed. Thus Sigurd's vengeance was secured, and victory was his. After this event, Sigurd returned home having gained great honor, but Regin wasted little time. As soon as Sigurd returned, he reminded him of their agreement, and so they both rode towards Fafnir's lair. When they got there, they came across the track along which Fafnir crawled whenever he went to get water. One thing was clear: Fafnir was no garden snake, for his tracks were massive. Then Regin offered some advice. "Dig a ditch and sit in it, and then, when the serpent crawls to the water, pierce him in the heart." But when Sigurd asked what he was supposed to do about the dragon's blood, because it would drown him if he were not prepared, Regin simply said, "How can anyone advise you if you're afraid of everything?" But then, while Sigurd rode off to prepare this ditch, Regin ran off in fear, which is a lovely touch of irony. Luckily for Sigurd, another more useful character was watching over him. A strange old man with a long beard appeared and gave Sigurd better advice, before disappearing again. And now he would be better prepared for his fight. When Fafnir came, the earth shook violently all around him. But when this dragon crawled over Sigurd's ditch, Sigurd plunged Gramr into Fafnir's heart, sinking it all the way up to the hilt. Fafnir thrashed around, causing great destruction, but this was his death wound. And so Sigurd had achieved the greatest victory. He had slain a dragon and entered an elite class of Norse heroes, dragon slayers. But was this accomplishment truly because of the sword alone? Regin would like us to think so. When Sigurd returns from this encounter, Regin comes out of his hiding to boast of how such a deed could not have been done without the sword that he forged for Sigurd. But Sigurd responds wisely, using words we ought to consider. When men come to battle, A fearless heart serves a man better than a sharp sword. We will return to this point at the end of this gathering, when we talk about what this sword and others like it meant for the society telling its story. For now, we'll settle by saying that this legendary sword, the sharp gift from Odin, continues to serve Sigurd, its fearless warrior, quite well. But if you want to hear more, you'll have to read the saga for yourself, because this ends our discussion of the legendary sword known as Gramr. Our next sword is called Sköfnungr, which means shin bone, according to Zoega's Old Icelandic Dictionary. But we can actually be a bit more confident in this name, because this sword actually has a special property for whenever it touches bone, which we'll get to later. So unlike Gramr, we have some literary context to help us out here, rather than just guessing based on some scanty linguistics. The saga that this sword comes from is known as Saga Kraka, or the Saga of King Hrolf Kraki. It belongs to the same literary genre as Volsunga Saga, but instead of following a family, this saga mostly centers around a legendary warrior chieftain from Denmark called King Hrolf Kraki. Like Volsunga Saga, its events take place in a distant heroic age, which probably have their roots in the historical memory of things that occurred around the 6th century. But the saga itself was written even later than Volsunga Saga, in the 14th century by yet another anonymous Icelander, which means that this saga should also be understood from the perspective of its unknown author's time. But let's not let that get us down. It is still a combination of both old and new, which is really not that much different from what we still do today, since we can never truly remove ourselves entirely from our present time. But before I start to sound like a mumbling old man, let's get on to the saga. Remember that epic build-up that we had for our previous sword, Gramr? And how Odin came disguised as an old man and thrust the sword into a great tree in the middle of a wedding feast? Well, the sword in this saga doesn't have such a lavish introduction. Instead, it is immediately put to action in the hands of its great hero, King Hrolf. But when I say immediately, I really mean that it doesn't get brought up at all until the end of the saga, when King Hrolf goes up against his enemy, King Aðils. But don't worry, this scene is actually pretty fantastic. While it may not be as epic as the one involving Odin and mythical trees, it is notable for another category: humor. So King Hrolf was pursuing King Aðils, who has gone mad over his greed for gold, and using his good wit, King Hrolf throws a precious ring, which actually once belonged to Aðils himself, right in front of Aðils. The greedy Aðils immediately stopped to pick it up, and while he did this, King Hrolf put his sword Sköfnungr to action. As the saga relates, King Hrolf galloped up and sliced off both of his buttocks right down to the bone. He did this with the sword Sköfnungr, the best sword ever carried in the northern lands. That's quite the entrance. Now the buttless King Aðils grew faint and ran away from King Hrolf with his tail, well, gone. But that's not all there is to say about Hrolf's sword in this saga. Although it came into the saga late and suddenly, he still manages to use his sword in his next and final battle. This time King Hrolf's enemy is a man named King Hjörvar, who is Hrolf's brother-in-law. You may recall that we once again have a conflict tearing apart kin who are meant to come together through marriage. But that's a topic for another day. For now, our focus should be on our sword. Like all great battles from legendary sagas, this one was furious, and King Hrolf, our great hero, was fighting courageously with his champions. And one of these champions comments on Hrolf's impressive fight.
Many mailcoats are now slit open, and many weapons are broken. Helmets are smashed, and brave knights are thrown from their mounts. Our king is in fine humor, for now he is as cheerful as when drinking deepest of his ale. He strikes with both hands. In battle, he is unlike other kings. To me, he seems to have the strength of 12 men. So many brave men has he killed. And now King Hjörvar can see that the sword Sköfnungr cuts. It rings loudly within their skulls.
So not only does this epic description remind us of Sigurd's battle when he sought vengeance for his father, but it also mentions an important feature of this legendary sword. It rings whenever it touches bone. And now the meaning of its name is a bit more clear to us. A sword called shin bone that rings whenever it touches bone. The two are surely connected. But will this sword be enough to grant him victory? Unfortunately for King Hrolf, it seems that having a sharp sword isn't enough to promise victory. Rather, such a blessing was Odin's domain alone. And to make matters worse for poor Hrolf, he had unknowingly insulted Odin, who was disguised as a farmer named Hrani, before this battle even occurred. You see, Hrani offered King Hrolf a shield, sword, and a coat of mail while they were his guests, but Hrolf refused them, calling them hideous. If you're a great warrior, the last thing you want to do is insult Odin, the erratic Norse god of war. And so, despite having a legendary sword, King Hrolf fell in battle. Victory was not his. And so a great burial mound was raised for him, and his impressive sword Sköfnungr, wherever it came from, was laid to rest beside him. That could have been the end of our discussion on Sköfnungr, but the legend lives on in other works of literature from medieval Iceland, starting with a book called Lenamabók, or the Book of Settlements. Technically speaking, this work isn't actually a saga, but rather a sort of historical account written during the 12th century, and at least in part originally written by a man named Ari Thorgilsson the Learned. It recounts the stories of the people who first settled Iceland at the end of the 10th century, often including some genealogical material concerning their ancestors and descendants. But although it is considered a historical work, it does still read like a saga, and has likely been colored to some extent by a similar literary weaving of traditional oral tales. But while we could spend an entire gathering, or multiple gatherings on this work alone, we'll just cut to the chase. There was a man named Skútaskegi who lived in Norway, and his son Bjorn later settles part of Iceland. His son was a man named Midfjordaskegi, who was a great fighter and merchant, and it is with him that our story about Sköfnungr picks up once again. One day he went on a voyage to plunder in the Baltic, a true Viking indeed. But on his way back, he made a quick stop in Denmark. And when I say quick, I really do mean it, because our source is very brief about this fascinating deed. In only one sentence, our source says that Midfjordaskegi went ashore and broke into Hrolfkaki's burial mound, taking away King Hrolf's sword Sköfnungr. And that's it. That's all we get. Of course, he does take a few other things, but they aren't important enough for our discussion today. But now we know, at least according to tradition, that Sköfnungr was passed into new hands long after King Hrolf's demise. Luckily, we're not done just yet, because Sköfnungr once again appears in yet another work of Icelandic literature, known as Kormáks Saga. This saga belongs to a different genre of medieval Icelandic literature, known as the Icelandic Sögur, or the Sagas of Icelanders, and these are my personal favorite. They tend to be narratives that follow the descendants of the families who settled Iceland. In this case, the central figure is a warrior poet named Cormac, but although the events of his tale take place in the 10th century, it was probably written in the early 13th century. So one day, Cormac gets into a feud with a man named Bersi the Dueler over a woman named Steingerd. Eventually, the tension between them builds until Cormac challenges Bersi to a duel. Now you tell me, is it really a good idea to challenge a man nicknamed the Dueler to a duel? Well, that's just not how Cormac rolls. He's the rash type, the one who acts before thinking. And to make matters worse for him, Bersi just happens to have his very own magical sword called Kviting, which is incredibly sharp and comes with a special healing stone. So what does our saga hero do? He runs home to his mother to ask for some advice, and she tells him to ask a man called Midfjordaskegi to borrow his sword Sköfnungr. Of course, as we heard before, Skegi isn't exactly eager to give up his plundered sword. He went through a lot of work to get that. But he does also mention that Cormac and Sköfnungr aren't exactly alike in temperament, saying, "Sköfnungr is slow, but you, Cormac, you're headstrong and rash." So Cormac just runs back home to his mother, who pretty much just tells him to be a bit more patient. Eventually, Skegi does agree to lend Cormac his sword, probably thanks to the persuasion of Cormac's mother. But there are a few rules that Cormac is supposed to follow if he wishes to use such a powerful sword. Here is what Skegi tells him. "Alright, Cormac, listen up. A pouch comes with this handy sword, but you are to leave it alone. Also, the sun is not supposed to shine on the upper boss of the sword hilt, so make sure you don't do that either. Oh, and you aren't supposed to wield this sword unless you're getting ready for combat, But if you do find yourself on the battlefield for some reason, make sure you sit by yourself somehow and draw it there. Just hold out the sword blade when you do, right in front of you, and blow on it. Look, I know it sounds weird, but you gotta do it, cause then a little snake's gonna crawl out from under the boss. When he does, just turn the sword sideways and make it possible for the little guy to crawl back under it again, okay? You follow me? Meanwhile, Cormac, who's probably rolling his eyes, says this in reply. What will you sorcerers think of next? But seriously, we have to stop for a moment. Where did all this stuff come from? None of these things were mentioned in Hrolf's Saga, so what do we make of this? I'm honestly not all that sure, but one idea we can play with is that Saga Icelanders love their "this is what you must do" speeches. In Njal's Saga, for example, Njal is always telling his close friend Gunnar what he must do in order to find success, which is usually advice about how he should behave, act, or what legal procedures he should follow. In our saga here, Skeggi does at least seem to be fitting into this kind of role by laying out the complicated yet responsible conditions that Cormac must follow if he wants the sword to grant him victory. But Cormac, as a headstrong man, intends to ignore good advice, which could be what the author is commenting on here. But it could be that the saga author is just trying to fit in all of the oral lore that he knows about this sword into his saga, which ends up coming across as a bit of a complicated mess of magical qualities that can only really be explained by some kind of sorcery, which is exactly what Cormac does. But, if nothing else, a lot of complicated rules and magical features, such as a mysterious pouch and a friendly sneck, sure do make for a much more interesting sword. But whatever all this means, one thing is certain. Cormac doesn't understand nor care about any of it. He simply rides back to his mother to show it off, and as though all of Skeggi's words had gone right over his head, he immediately tries to pull it out of its sheath. Remember, he wasn't supposed to do that unless he was in battle. But our sword Sköfnungr is a stubborn boy, so it doesn't budge for him. But headstrong Cormac responds by placing his feet on the hilt and tearing off that magical and mysterious pouch that he wasn't supposed to touch. This causes Sköfnungr to scream at him in rage, while still refusing to listen to him. Honestly, this whole scene just unfolds as though Cormac is an impatient teenager trying to get something to work by banging it around all over the place. And things honestly just get worse as Cormac continues to blunder around with the sword. First of all, he doesn't care if the sun shines on it or not, so he ignores that warning. Then, when he can't unsheath it, he just steps all over the boss until the little sneck comes out, probably flustered. In the end, the saga simply says, things were in no way handled as they should have been, and the spell of the sword was broken. It came out of the sheath screaming. So when it comes to Cormac's fight with Bersi, nothing goes well for him at all. Even when Sköfnungr cuts the tip off of Bersi's sword Kvíting, the broken tip falls and cuts Cormac's hand, which causes blood to fall on the cloak beneath them, meaning that Cormac lost the duel. To make matters worse, Cormac caused a nick in the edge of Sköfnungr, which only grew larger the more him and his friends tried to fix it. Well, this is just a disaster, isn't it? So when Cormac returns the blade and says that he lost, Skeggi simply replies, "Oh, things turned out just how I expected they would, Cormac." And then Cormac leaves, continuing to complain about how everything had turned out so poorly for him. And I'm not just saying that trying to be funny, because he literally recites multiple stanzas of poetry complaining about how much this sword failed him. Just listen to this stuff. I've gone to the dueling isle, and I thought I'd have better luck, to fight the forest lair's dweller, the bear of the golden handstone. The famous fist wand failed me when it broke in my hand. The inciter of men to slaughter has suffered many a setback. That's me, by the way. It was hardly a strong-edged slaying wand that Skeggi gave me to battle. That snake was not supple as it struck from that shore of the shield strap's land. Sköfnungr made a healthy job of cutting Kvíting in two from the hilt. I have chipped a hole in the shield strap's staff, now shortened. How useless. Seriously, of little gain in combat my staff of slaughter proved when I hewed shield rims. The hand's sharp-toothed bear charged into battle. There was clamor when the bruin of blood, unwilling for truce, left its lair, its slender scabbard on its way to the shield where the Sea King dwells. Seriously, this guy is a piece of work. But our dealings with Cormac are finally at an end. Sköfnungr is back in Skeggie's hands after all of its horrible mistreatment. But while our poor sword has been screaming with frustration at Cormac's manhandling, this saga has added several layers of complexity to Sköfnungr. And yet our sword story goes on, because we still have one more saga to go before we are actually finished telling its story. Sköfnungr continues to appear in Iceland, but this time in a saga called Laxdæla Saga, or the Saga of the People of Salmon River Valley. This saga also belongs to the genre of the Icelandic Sögur, and it tells of a tragic love story between a woman named Gudrun and two foster brothers named Boli and Kjartan. Like most sagas of this genre, the events mainly take place during the 10th century, but the saga itself wasn't written until the late 13th century. By now, some time has passed since the events of Cormac's saga, and so our sword is now in the hands of a man named Eid, who is the son of Skeggi. The saga tells us that one of Eid's sons was killed by a man named Grim, who was now an outlaw, but Eid was too old to hunt down Grim himself, so no action was ever taken against him. But one day, one of Eid's kinsmen comes to help, a man named Thorkel Eyjolfsson, who is from a prominent family. He offers to hunt down Grim by himself, for there is more honor in killing this outlaw alone than if he did it with many men to help him. But of course, Thorkel does ask for one thing to support him on this journey: the sword Sköfnungr. But Eid actually respects Thorkel, so he doesn't have a problem lending the sword to him. But there are some conditions, and here is what he tells Thorkel. The sun must not be allowed to shine on its hilt, nor may it be drawn in the presence of women. Any wound it inflicts will not be healed unless it is rubbed with the healing stone which accompanies it. And unlike Cormac, Thorkel actually pays attention to this and says that he will follow these instructions carefully, and so he does. But before we move on, we should talk about this for a moment. Although his instructions sure do sound similar, Eid does tell Thorkel something slightly different than what Skeggi once told Cormac. The sun still can't shine on its hilt, but now it cannot be drawn in the presence of women? But what happened to our mysterious pouch? And where did this healing stone come from? And honestly, I must say, I'm a little disappointed that our little snack buddy isn't mentioned this time. It's honestly hard to make sense out of these things, especially as we're still scratching our heads over Skeggi's odd conditions. But I'm confident that we can at least get something out of this. Remember how I mentioned that the saga author of Cormac's saga may have been working with too much old lore about Sköfnungr? Well, I think it's helpful to point out that these two sagas, Cormac's saga and Laxdæla saga, actually take place in the same region of Iceland. You can refer to the map on my website page in the description if you want to see this for yourself, but otherwise you can take my word for it. But with that said, the similarities of these passages could tell us one of two things: that the author of this saga borrowed from the author of Cormac's saga, or that they were both pulling on the same pool of oral lore floating around this region of Iceland. But since they don't match up very well, seeing as though each saga has similar but somewhat different idea of what Sköfnungr's magical properties are, I'm going to lean towards the latter option. And I'm not just working on a personal hunch here, because there's actually an entire book that talks about how oral traditions helped shape the sagas, and it's called The Medieval Icelandic Saga, an Oral Tradition by Gisli Sigurdsson. Think about it. Skeggi is said to have stolen this sword from King Hrolf's burial mound before coming back to this part of Iceland to settle down. And that's not something that people just keep quiet about. They talked and shared stories about this mysterious sword, creating a pool of local lore about this fascinating object within their community. And I really do think that these sagas, which are about these communities, weave these oral tales, whether historically true or not, into their new written narratives. So even though it seems like Laxdæla saga mixes up a few things that were kept apart in Cormac's saga, I really don't think it's all that strange that Sköfnungr now comes with a healing stone, since there was a similar local tradition about Bersi's sword Kviting having one in Cormac's saga. But does this mean that the author of Laxdæla saga really mixed them up? Who are we supposed to believe here? It's hard to say, but one thing about oral lore is that it's really never the same, and honestly I find that to be one of its charms. But for now, we'll just have to attribute this healing stone to Sköfnungr, since that is how it has been presented to us here. But moving on, Thorkel takes Sköfnungr on his quest to hunt down the outlaw Grim. He actually wields the sword well. He gives Grim a good wound on the arm before eventually being overcome by Grim's strength. But they don't kill each other. Instead, they become friends and agree to help one another. And so Thorkel heals the wound that he dealt Grim using Sköfnungr's healing stone. After this, several chapters pass before Sköfnungr is mentioned again, and although the sword was lent to him for this errand alone, Thorkel decides to hang on to it for himself for a while. But one day, Thorkel decides to brave bad weather in order to sail a ship full of timber to his home. And while he sailed, he kept Sköfnungr in a chest. But the bad weather bested him, and his ship capsized. He and his crew drowned, and Sköfnungr drifted ashore onto an island, which gets its name from the sword. The saga later tells us that a man named Gellir, the son of Thorkel, takes possession of the sword, presumably having gone to the island and retrieving it. But when he grew old, he went on a pilgrimage to St. Peter and took the sword abroad with him. And on his way home, he stopped in Denmark, where he became ill and passed away. And so the sword has been returned to Denmark, and the saga ends its tale by saying that it was never recovered again. So after our own crazy journey, jumping from one saga to another, our discussion about the legendary sword known as Sköfnungr finally comes to a full circle. And so we shall now move on to our next and final sword for today's gathering. Our final sword is called Grásíða, which means grey side, or perhaps even grey blade. But like Gramr, we really don't have enough context to help us understand the deeper meaning of this name. Vésteinn Ólafsson, however, does point out that it is interesting for a sword like this one to have a grammatically feminine name, since the rest have a masculine one. But he believes that this name probably refers to the color of the blade itself, which may sound pretty boring. But luckily for us, he does offer some more interesting speculation. Although I should emphasize that it is speculation, once again based on linguistic relationships and the small amount of literary context that we actually have for the sword. Nevertheless, he does mention that the color gray tends to be symbolically associated with trickery and deception, and that the word síða could be related to a verb that means to perform magic. This is worth considering, because magic does play a role in this sword story, and so do trickery and deception. But moving along, the saga that this sword comes from is known as Gísla Saga, or the Saga of Gisli Sursun. It is counted among the Icelandic Sögur, but many also admire it for being part of a subgenre called outlaw sagas. It follows the life of a man named Gisli, who truly embodies the heroic values of the Viking Age, but not without some notes of tragic realism and contemporary criticism of these values, because this saga was written in the 13th century by yet another anonymous Icelander. As such, although its events take place in the 10th century, it reflects the mentalities and sentiments of its later audience. But to make things more confusing for you, the person our story begins with is a man named Gisli, but not the Gisli who this saga is actually named after. Instead, this Gisli is actually his uncle from Norway. But the saga kicks off with his older brother Ari, who is challenged to a duel by a crazy berserk named Fjorn, who stomps all over Norway, bullying people into dueling him. Unfortunately for Ari, this Fjorn stumbles across him and demands a duel, or else he must give up his wife, Ingebjorg. Of course, Ari agrees to fight him without hesitation, but ends up killed by Fjorn. When Ari's brother Gisli learns of this, he says that he would rather die than allow Ingebjorg to fall into the hands of a berserk like Fjorn, and so he challenges Fjorn to yet another duel. But this time, Ingebjorg decides to offer some assistance, saying this to Gisli.
"You know, Gisli, I did not marry Ari because I preferred him to you. In fact, I think you should know that my slave Cole has a sword called Grásíða, and you should ask him to lend it to you, since whoever fights with it is assured victory."
While it is pretty harsh that she didn't mention this sword to her husband Ari, who just died trying to protect her from Fjorn, Gisli definitely appreciates her suggestion and goes to Cole to ask for this sword. Now, I'm not exactly sure why a slave has such an impressive weapon either, but he sure is very reluctant to give it up, not that we can blame him. He eventually does agree to lend it to Gisli though. And so, with this sword, Gisli wins his victory against Fjorn, marries Ingebjorg, and acquires great wealth and honor. But when Cole demands the return of this sword, Gisli proves unwilling to part with it. Cole obviously is angry about this, and so he attacks Gisli, and the two fight each other to the death. But during the fight, Gisli deals such a blow to Kol that the sword shatters. For a while, the broken sword fades into the background of the saga as its fragments are passed on to Gisli's brother Thorbjorn. Shortly thereafter, Thorbjorn has two sons, Thorkel and Gisli, and this is the Gisli whom the saga is named after. But as time goes on, tension builds up between these two brothers over conflicting loyalties. While they are still in Norway, for example, there was a man named Bard who was seducing their sister Thordis. Thorbjorn and Gisli do not approve of this at all, but Thorkel was a close friend of Bard's, so he didn't really care too much. But Gisli, who acts according to the more traditional and perhaps heroic code of behavior, eventually kills Bard for dishonoring their family. But Thorkel disagrees and betrays his own family by working against them with Bard's kinsmen for a while, even urging them to take vengeance against his own brother. But somehow, the brothers eventually get past all of this and become close again. But later on, when in Iceland, their bond is once again tested. This time, they both have married women from different families, meaning that they each have a new brother-in-law. Gisli is now the brother-in-law to a man named Vestane, while Thorkel is now the brother-in-law to a man named Thorgrim. These four men become a close company, but eventually, when they try to forge a sworn brotherhood together, Thorgrim declares that he is under no obligation to bind himself to Vestane. This marks the beginning of a theme of tension between people who are meant to come closer together through marriage, and this is a theme you may recall from Volsunga Saga, where conflict erupted between families who tried to solidify peace through marriage. The similarities between these two sagas have not gone completely unnoticed by scholarship either. Theodore M. Anderson, for example, has something to say about these similarities between Gisla Saga and Volsunga Saga in his book called The Growth of the Medieval Icelandic Saga, although he generally talks about the parts that we haven't covered during this gathering. But one thing he does say is that Gisli is clearly modeled to some extent after Sigurd, our dragon-slaying hero from before. But even beyond the characters themselves, we do have the same overarching theme of strife between people who are meant to come together. That's not all there is in terms of similarities. Doesn't Grásíða's story so far sound awfully familiar? We not only have a special sword that grants victory, but one that also gets shattered when that blessing of victory runs dry. That sounds a lot like Gramr, doesn't it? So would this blade get reforged just as Gramr was? Actually, yes, but not in the same way. After hearing some unsettling gossip between their wives, the tension between these men builds even more, and things are about to get worse when a strange man called Thorgrim Neff comes into the picture. In fact, Thorgrim and Thorkel actually invite him to their home while they're having a feast. But this Neff guy is described by the saga as being a man well versed in spells and magic, and sorcerers in the sagas rarely ever mean that happy times are ahead. But Neff isn't just a sorcerer, as if that's not bad news enough. He also just happens to be a very skilled blacksmith. So here we have some salty brothers, a broken sword, and a blacksmithing sorcerer who came into the saga from left field. What could possibly go wrong? Well, it wouldn't be a very interesting story if they just ate good food and went home, now would it? So instead of just having a peaceful evening drinking by the hearthside, Thorgrim and Thorkel pull our sorcerer friend aside and ask him to forge a spearhead out of the fragments of Grásíða. Now, I think it goes without saying that a spearhead forged in secrecy by a sorcerer, using the magical fragments of a sword that broke during a greedy quarrel over the sword's possession, can't possibly mean anything good. So unlike Gramr, which experienced a heroic rebirth, Grásíða has undergone a sinister transformation, because while it is in this form it commits terrible acts, which include a few cloak and dagger murders. But the details of those acts are not important for our gathering today, so you'll have to read the saga for yourself if you'd like to know more. So let's end our discussion on Grásíða and actually talk about all of these swords together, because these swords weren't just really cool objects to talk about, they actually had symbolic meaning for the society telling their tales. So far, we have shared the stories of 3 different swords from 5 different sagas, along with a brief interlude from the Icelandic Book of Settlements. First, we had the sword known as Gramr from Volsunga Saga, which was a gift from Odin himself to a legendary family called the Volsungs. Then we had Sköfnungr, which was the mighty blade of a legendary king named Hrolf Kraki before it was passed around the hands of various Icelanders, who used it in duels and for hunting down outlaws. And finally we had the lesser-known sword called Grásíða, which promised victory in duels, but eventually gets reforged into an infamous spear through sorcery. So what do all these swords mean, and what do they have in common? While we could just talk about how awesome these swords are, I think it's important to ask ourselves why anonymous Icelandic authors are still writing about these legendary swords during the 13th century, and perhaps even why we still enjoy their stories today. What is it about these swords that still captivate our imaginations? To answer these questions, let's consider what scholars have said about these fascinating objects. So when it comes to the sword Gramr, it seems most obvious to consider the sword as a symbol of one's right to rule, which is what the scholar J. de Vries has argued. After all, I'm sure most of us immediately recalled the legend of Excalibur when we heard of Sigmund pulling this sword from the tree. But H.R. Ellis Davidson has complicated this picture a bit, arguing that the setting of a wedding suggests that this sword was also considered symbolic of the continuation of the family. Sigmund does use this sword to save his family from a disastrous marriage, and it is he who continues the family line after those terrible events. In fact, the sword is passed on to Sigurd, who is Sigmund's son, which could be symbolic of the passing of the responsibility concerning the future of the family. But what about the promise of victory? While the sword seems to grant victory in battle, I think that's something we should attribute more to Odin, or at least to what Odin represents. Even for the Christianized Icelandic authors rewriting these stories, Odin was a symbolic force that granted victory in battle, and as a god of war, it's really not all that strange to find swords linked to him. This sword was his gift, and as a result, it also symbolizes the blessing of victory to its wielder, which could also be broken. But what about Sigurd's words to Regin, that when men come to battle, a fearless heart serves a man better than a sharp sword? It sounds like Sigurd is saying that these swords aren't actually all that special, but he's got a point, at least the author of his saga does. And although writing about medieval Irish literature, William Sayers has noticed this as well, arguing that special objects like these don't actually have an inherent significance, but rather gain their meaning from the people who interact with them. In other words, a sword really is just a sword, but a sword blessed by Odin and wielded by a courageous and talented young hero becomes something far more. After all, it's not the sword who takes vengeance for Sigmund, but Sigurd himself. And it's not really the sword who faces against Fafnir, but the fearless Sigurd. And if the sword itself truly was capable of acting on its own, then even the wimpy Regin could have wielded it to kill Fafnir. But instead, he ran and hid behind a bush while Sigurd did the slaying. Honestly, the same could be said about Sköfnungr, which served King Hrolf impeccably, but completely failed Cormac. If the sword itself could assure victory, then why did it fail Cormac? Heather O'Donoghue notes that the saga never explicitly states why Sköfnungr failed Cormac in battle, but does acknowledge that it was likely because Cormac completely ignored all of Skeggie's instructions. In other words, the sword's meaning has changed because its overall context has as well. It is now in the hands of a different user, and even a different author writing a different story, perhaps one that's commenting on youthful warriors who ignore their wise elders. But to keep this discussion concise and on track, we'll just say that a legendary sword's meaning and function actually changed based on the context of the story surrounding it. So what do we make of Grásíða then? Indeed, we once again have a sword with special properties, and Uncle Gisli uses this sword to win a duel, marry a woman, and gain great renown. So what's the catch here? Well, this time two men fight over who shall possess the sword, and later the sword is reforged into a spear through dark sorcery, a spear that is used for committing murders under the cloak of night. So what is the deeper meaning of this sword? Vésteinn Olason has offered an explanation, saying that Grásíða, quote, remains in the possession of the family and, while enshrining the heroic values passed down from one generation to the next, also becomes a symbol of the bad luck that haunts it. In other words, our sword is indeed legendary, but comes with a price, a curse even. And so within the context of Gisla Saga, a legendary sword symbolizes the old heroic values that we hear of in sagas like Volsunga Saga, but also emphasizes the dangers of such power and responsibility. And so this saga suggests that legendary swords, while symbolic of ancient heroic values, could also become overwhelming, consuming the user and leading them to greater hardship. But before we get too lost in all of this rich academic discussion, let's reel everything back together, shall we? What do we take away from all of this? Let's start with the common features that these legendary swords share. They are all associated with victory in battle, they all have supernatural qualities, and they all have a history that follows them. The differences between them, on the other hand, are determined by how each sword is used in a given saga. As a result, we end up with 3 fairly different legendary swords. One that allows its user to protect and progress their family, one that may help its user find victory in battle if they wield it properly, and another that grants its user victory, but also corrupts them. In the end, these are truly fascinating objects with deep roots in old lore that has been passed down for generations. But they have also been colored with deeper meaning by later authors who wrote to keep these stories alive for their own contemporary societies to enjoy. Even today, we continue to attribute new meaning to these objects as we continue to interpret their legends in relation to our own journeys through life. But that's likely enough seriousness for one gathering. In fact, I hope we have not already lost people to the depths of their mead as I have rambled on about the academic side of things. But before we go, I'd like to know this. Which sword would rule them all? Could Gramr defeat Sköfnungr with its massive list of magical properties and special conditions? While Gramr may have slain the great serpent Fafnir, could it really take on the snake living under Sköfnungr's hilt? Or would Grásíða have them all beat, after being reforged by a blacksmithing sorcerer? Let me know which sword you think could beat them all. But until next time, make sure your wits are as sharp as Hrolf's sword Sköfnungr, because you never know when you're going to have to cleave off someone's butt. I'm Fjorn, your humble skald, and thank you for joining me today. That's all for today, my friends. Thank you for listening. Make sure to check out today's featured artifact on your way out. Also, as a reminder, you can support this show simply by spreading the word on your wings. You can also tip this skald on Ko-fi.com, because I really do enjoy my coffee. And to my fantasy friends, don't forget to check out my free web novels at Failnir.com. But until next time, keep wandering.